To fix your dovetails, if you have a gap, there's a couple of different methods that you can use, from making your own shims using some of the scrap cutoffs to using wood filler, and you can also make your own wood filler using sawdust and glue. But if I can use pieces of the cutoff to make my own shims, I would rather do that because I've had a couple of pieces that I've used wood filler on in the past, and it just doesn't age the same. And it looks good at the beginning, but after a few years you'll notice that it doesn't darken like the rest of the wood does. So let me pull you a little bit closer and show you how I use the cutoffs from the dovetails to make the shims. Depending on the size of the gap that you need to fill, you can use something as small and thin like this. This is just a cutoff that I found on the floor here in the garage. Or if you need to make a thicker shim like this one right here for the gap that I need to fill, you can use this cutoff. This is the dovetail waste that I cut off in between the pins. So hang on to some of these, that way you know that unless you're perfect at cutting dovetails, you're going to need to fix some of the gaps. And you know that since this came from the boards that we're using, it's going to be pretty close in color. I need to make a relatively decent sized shim, as you can see here. So I'm going to show you how I made that. Just take one of the dovetail waste cutoffs and put it in a clamp and just barely clamp it. This is a parallel clamp. If you have one of those wooden clamps, they're probably a whole lot better. But this is all that I have. Just put it in there so it holds it, but it's not too tight because we're going to be splitting this, so it's going to need to move. And then taking a 3/4 inch chisel, put it about 1/8 of an inch from the edge. And since this piece is angled at the angle of the dovetails, I'm going to angle my chisel to roughly what I believe is that same angle. And then just using a mallet, just hammer it down and it'll split along the grain. And what you're left with is a nice shim that you can use. And if for some reason it doesn't split right, you can just take a chisel and very carefully just pare away some of that excess. So this is the gap that I'm going to have to fix. And as you can see, it's a pretty good sized gap. So I'm going to have to use a relatively thick shim. So to begin, I like to take the shim and start to hit it in, and just to see how it's going to fit. And that's probably as much as I'm going to hit that in, because like I was saying, it doesn't matter how deep you go. You just need to go deep enough that when you saw this and sand it, that you know that you're not going to see this gap anymore. It doesn't matter if it doesn't go the full thickness of this board, because all we're doing is just trying to hide the gap that you see visually, just so it doesn't look as bad. So that's a good fit. And looking under it, I don't see the gap anymore anywhere, so that's all I'm going to go for. And so now I'm just going to put a little glue on it because it doesn't require much. And then just use an acid brush, move it around, and again put it back in the same way that I tested it. And I'm going to use a mallet and take a look, remove the excess glue just to make sure that it's bottomed out. And it's a nice tight fit, so I know that once I flush this up, you're not going to see that gap anymore. So I'm going to let this dry for about an hour, and then I'll come back, flush it up, and then I'll show you what it looks like. So now that the glue is dried, I'm going to go ahead and use a flush trim saw and remove this excess. And for demonstration purposes, I'm just going to sand this with some 120 grit sandpaper, just using my sander to flush it up to give you a good idea of what it's going to look like when I apply some denatured alcohol. So wiping some alcohol on it just to see what the piece is going to look like with some finish on it. And as you can see, it's great. I mean, it's not perfect. I can see a slight line where it's two separate pieces, but it's a great alternative to using any wood putty or sawdust slurry with glue. I would much rather put a piece of wood in there any day of the week instead of wood filler, especially on a gap that big, because all you see is a hairline, not even a crack, just a little different color where it's two separate pieces. But this is a great way to fix your dovetails. This video was taken from the Blanket Chest Guild build over on SimpleCoveGuild.com, where I show you step by step how to build this blanket chest. So if you're interested in the free plans and you want to see more videos, just head on over to SimpleCoveGuild.com.